There's a workshop in Geneva's Old Town, small by industrial standard. A team of watchmakers, maybe 150 people across all of their operations. It's a boutique strategy that by design limits how many watches they can sell a year. A wait list for like the most sought after pieces, they stretch years out. And in the middle of that, there is a man who's been making watches since he was 20 years old. Not overseeing, not directing, making at the bench with his hands for 50 years. His name is François-Paul Journe, and he is, by the reckoning of nearly every serious collector, every serious journalist, he's the most important living watchmaker in the world. And this episode is about him, and it's been coming since episode 13, and I think, I'm ready to deliver it.
In the old brass glow, you bend the morning thin. Little rooms of steel where the minutes sleep within. Tiny moonlit screws and a patient hand. You turn a silent world till it learns to stay.
Welcome back to What's on Your Riste. I'm Wachowski. 18 episodes in. We've been around the world: Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, France, America, Japan, Britain. We've covered tool watches and philosophy and security and the bloodline of Renault and Papy. We've spent an entire episode on Rexhep Rexhepi, the watchmaker who trained with Journe and absorbed his operational philosophy. And through all of it, his name has kind of been in the background. F.P. Journe. So today, finally, we're here. This one matters. Segment one, we're going to go from Marseille to Paris and really talk about the origin. Now, Francois was born in Marseille in 1957, and he was, by his own cheerful admission, not particularly an engaged student. And he's joked in interviews that he might have become a butcher if his cousin hadn't been the head of a watchmaking school in Marseille. Because after Journe was expelled from school, his parents they needed to put him somewhere, and his cousin's school was basically a convenient answer for them. And this is, as origin stories go, again, another remarkable one. What happened when he arrived at the watchmaking school, there is something that really matters. He found that he was actually really good at this, really good at precision work, the mechanical thinking of it all, he had an obsessive attention to tiny tolerances and tiny components. And something in how his mind worked seemed to match watchmaking and what watchmaking was asking of people who made watches. And so he graduated from the Paris Watchmaking School in 1976. And remember, this is someone that was actually expelled from school before. And he had continued his education in the French capital. And then he did what most young, talented watchmakers of his generation did. He went to school or to work in an established workshop. Specifically, he went to work for his uncle, Michel Journe, who ran a clock and watch restoration atelier in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And it's kind of this historic Paris neighborhood. So Michel Journe's workshop was not making new watches, it was kind of restoring the old ones. Antique clocks, important historical pocket watches, pieces, by Breguet and Janvier and great watch and clock makers of like the 17th and 18th centuries. And so Francois Paul, he spent 8 years there. He learned kind of the deepest history of the craft by handling its most important surviving objects. And he has said of those years, my 8-year period working with my uncle allowed me to discover the origins of watchmaking up to the 19th century, and it really enabled me to meet many important collectors. And while he was there, outside business hours, using his uncle's workshop and tools, when the restoration clients had left, he started building something of his own. And he really became fascinated by the tourbillon, specifically by the extraordinary tourbillon pocket watches he encountered on the wrists and in the collections of clients who brought their pieces into Michel's workshop, and he wanted one. And like many of these watchmakers, he could not afford one, so he decided to build one. And Journe started sketching his first tourbillon at roughly the age of about 20. And he also read George Daniels' book, but he read the book The Art of Breguet. The same George Daniels that we spent time on in other episodes, and Daniels' account of Breguet's tourbillon mechanism kind of lit a fire in FP. And he worked on the tourbillon in his uncle's workshop in the evenings and on weekends, but alone and by hand for 7 years. And in early 1983, the watch was finished. It was a pocket watch with a tourbillon and signed F.P. Journe, Paris on the dial. Every single component, the case in gold and silver, the movement, the hands, all made by Journe's own hands. And he was 26 years old. In 1985, he set up his own workshop in Paris, making these bespoke, complicated pocket watches for top collectors. And the watches that followed an astronomical chronometer, planetarium, clocks with, various spectacular complications, established his reputation among this small group of collectors who were really paying attention. And at age, 22, he'd already been commissioned by this Parisian atelier to design this planetarium mechanism for Asprey in London. And the name, again, you're going to recognize this from episode 12, the same Asprey that, where Stefan Forzi and Bart Grunfeld did time kind of early in their careers. And so by 1991, Journe had made his first tourbillon watch. And it's the direct ancestor of what would eventually become his kind of debut production piece. A handful of these watches were sold to collectors who knew what they were looking at. And the watch world hadn't caught up yet with what François-Paul Journe was making, but boy, oh boy, was it about to. So segment 2, we're going to talk about Geneva, 1999, and we're going to call this the debut. Okay. My subheader for this section was, I had it as called the founding, the subscription, and then also the beginning of a legend. So in 1999, François-Paul Journe moved to Geneva, the watchmaking capital. And at Basel World that year, again, the industry's biggest annual trade show, he launched a brand under his own name. Now, here comes, Riste practicing his French. So F.P. Journe, and you're going to have this Latin afterwards. Now, as if it wasn't bad enough for me to pronounce French, and now I'm going to get into Latin as well. So, invenit et fecit. It's invenit space et space fecit. And it basically in Latin means invented and made. Now, the phrase is stamped on every movement Journe produces. It's not marketing language, it's a factual description of his working method and a philosophical statement about what watchmaking means to him. Journe designs his watches and he makes them, not in a different building, not by another team. The watchmaker who imagines the mechanism is the same watchmaker who's responsible for the workshop that produces it. So his debut, the Tourbillon Souverain, it's offered by subscription, like subscription, right? Meaning that collectors commit to the purchase before the watches are made, 20 pieces, and then the movement features something that at the time no wristwatch tourbillon had ever incorporated, a remontoire d'égalité. And it's basically a constant force mechanism. So let me explain what that means, even though I can't pronounce it, because it matters for everything that's going to follow. So the mainspring, as it unwinds, it delivers diminished torque to the movement, meaning that as the mainspring, when you wind it all the way up, it has the most amount of torque. And then as that mainspring slowly unwinds and uncoils itself, it has progressively less torque, okay? And so this diminished torque on the movement is problematic. And so a gear train works to regulate this problem. And so an escapement is trying to compensate for this problem. But the variation there is real. And so a fully wound watch, for example, keeps slightly different time typically than a watch that's wound, halfway and 3/4 of the way and so on. And so watchmakers have known this problem for centuries. And so the remontoire he designed solves this. It's a small secondary spring. It's wound periodically by the mainspring. Now, this delivers power to the escapement in these identical pulses, but it does it every second. And so the escapement actually never sees the varying torque of the mainspring. It only sees constant, even force of the secondary spring. And so the result is that the escapement runs much more accurately, and it's at every state of winding, it's exactly the same. And so Journe put a remontoire in his first production wristwatch, and no one had ever combined a tourbillon with a remontoire in a wristwatch before, and he did it in 1999. This was his debut, like, hey, dudes, I'm just going to show up and show you this, right? And so the subscription pieces, they sold out. And again, collectors noticed. And then something very unusual happened. the early FP Journe watches, the Subscription, the Tourbillon, the Souverain, the first Octa pieces, they were made with movements like in brass, like most watchmakers. And then Journe made a decision that the entire history of modern watchmaking, no other manufacturer at scale has replicated. He switched all of his movements to 18 karat rose gold. Like not just the visible bridges, like all of the plates, all of the bridges, every single gear, every component that could be made in gold is made in gold. Now, movement components in 18 karat gold in production watches is not like it's not like a one-off. Like but why? Gold has different mechanical properties than brass. It is more stable against temperature fluctuations. It doesn't corrode. It is, on the other hand, softer, which actually can improve behavior of certain fine components. And this is the part that makes kind of watchmakers genuinely sort of pause. It is kind of beautiful in a way that brass simply is not. And Journe, a Journe movement under a case back looks completely different in this sort of material sense from any other production watch in the industry. And again, no one else does this at any price. And the cost alone, again, is prohibitive for most brands. Journe decided that this is a non-negotiable, whatever the price of gold is at the time, right? And people know that gold prices and precious metals prices have kind of gone crazy in the last 5 years or so. That decision made in like the mid 2000s is a definitive statement of his values as anything else that he's ever done or said before. It's saying that there are no compromises here. Okay. Now we're going to get into the resonance. This is a mechanism that kind of defines him, and I think it's kind of the most important watch in the Journe catalog for understanding this person. Kind of the technical, but not necessarily the human component of it. So we're going to get into this as well. Okay. So now the watch that, in my view, most completely captures FP Journe is what they're about is not the Tourbillon. It's the Chronomètre Résonance. It's launched in 2000 and still the most technically singular watch in regular production anywhere in the world. And let me kind of explain what I'm going to talk about here. So the resonance uses this phenomenon observed by the Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens. And that was in like 1665. And Huygens noticed that two pendulum clocks hung on the wall over time synchronized their swings. Their oscillations would couple, influence each other through the shared mechanical connections of the wall until they were beating basically in precise opposition, not randomly synchronizing, opposite synchronization. And so like two partners breathing, one in, one out, sort of like me sitting in a room in a vacuum with a tree, right? I'd breathe in, it would breathe out. I would breathe out, it would breathe in. And so Huygens recognized this as this kind of a precision advantage. If one clock was running slightly faster than the other slightly slower, the resonance between those two would pull them toward the correct rate, and the errors would cancel themselves out. Okay, now let's get into Antide Jean Vier and Abraham Louis Breguet. Both of these people experimented with resonance clocks and pocket watches in the 18th century. And the principle was understood, but no one had made it work reliably in a wristwatch because wristwatches, they move constantly. They're on your wrist and they're moving through space and at different angles, and we're dum-dums and we bump them against stuff, right? So the conditions for these kind of stable resonance systems that worked in like a wall-mounted clock, for example, that seemed pretty impossible to replicate on something that a human arm would wear that was moving around. And Journe, again, like most of our folks that we've covered in this podcast, they're obsessive. Journe spent 15 years figuring out how to do this. And he placed two independent balance wheels in very close proximity on a single case. And they were close enough that the tiny air pressure variations that were created by each balance oscillation, the spring expanding and contracting, kind of think of it as breathing in and breathing out, breathing in and breathing out, they could actually influence each other's balance. And when the conditions were just right, the two balances synchronized, but in opposite phase oscillations, beating against each other, not with each other. And the precision benefit that Huygens observed in like the 1600s in his clocks was now applied on the wrist. And so the practical result, if your wrist movement accelerates one balance, the resonance effect will slow it back down. And if the temperature changes affects one, then the shared oscillation will correct it. And the two balances keep each other honest. It's a check and balance. It's a yin and yang. It's a husband and a wife, right, on your wrist. And there's, again, there's no single balance that can achieve this alone. And so when you look at a resonance dial, it has two sets of subdials, one for each balance, each with its own time display. Local time on one side, and typically what you'll see is a second time zone on the other. And the symmetrical layout is really unmistakable. When you look at it, you are looking at the visible expression of an invisible physical phenomenon. You're looking at resonance. And the subscription resonance pieces that have sold at Philips auctions for like over 1 million Swiss francs, those are crazy. The current caliber 1520 that was released in 2020 for the 20th anniversary adds a single mainspring with a differential. It's visible on the center of the dial, and it's splitting power equally to both going trains. And it adds, because it wasn't more complicated enough, right? They're going to add a remontoire to each going train as well. And so the 2020 Resonance has one barrel, one differential, two going trains, two remontoires, two balance wheels, and it's all snuck into a wristwatch somehow. And I want you to sit with this for a second. Again, one barrel, one differential, two going trains, two remontoires, two balance wheels, again, in a wristwatch. It's not like a demonstration piece. This isn't like a concept, like a one off. This is like a watch that you can order in platinum or rose gold and actually have this watch on your wrist. And it's a watch that's built around a mechanism that Breguet theorized and François-Paul Journe spent 15 years making. This is what this guy does. Now, segment 4, I'm going to get into this. I'm going to call this the collection or guided tour. We're going to take a walk, but it's going to be a brisk walk. But you should know some of these names. And again, I will do my best with the pronunciation, but just bear with me. And I apologize to my brothers in Switzerland. I'm doing my best here. So let me talk you through the Journe collection because I think it deserves this sort of guided tour. So the Tourbillon Souverain is their first piece, their flagship. The Tourbillon with the remontoire, de Galetat, they currently feature this kind of vertical tourbillon cage, and they were redesigned in the 20th anniversary to ensure consistent amplitude, whether the watch was laying flat on its side. The movement, again, is 18 karat gold, and the prices start well above 150,000 euros, right? Then they have the Chronomètre Souverain. This is kind of like the everyday Journe, if there is such a thing as an everyday Journe. The time-only watch with a very distinctive asymmetric layout. And the hour and the minute dial, they're offset to the right, small seconds is to the left, and the power reserve is above. No complications beyond like a regulator style display on the kind of like, and this just outstanding precision. And this is the piece most Journe collectors have. The guilloche, a silver dial, blued hands, rose gold movement visible through the case back, and they start somewhere around the 50,000 euros for like the new examples, and they are considerably more on secondary market. Again, if you can even get them retail. Now they have the Chronomètre Resonance, and that is the crown jewel of the collection. Again, in my opinion, we just told kind of the story of the dual oscillators, constant force resonance, two going trains, most technically distinctive watch in regular production anywhere in the world. Then there's also the Octa family, Journe's self-winding automatic watches, the Octa Automatique. It's kind of their entry-level automatic, again, if there is such a thing in Journe. The Octa Lune, which adds a moon phase. There's a calendar version, which is a complete calendar. They have the UTC, which has a second time zone. And so the Octa family has this specific characteristic that collectors love. There is this eccentric time display. It's offset from the center that allows room for other functions, all automatic, all rose gold movements. Again, the Octa is where many Journe collectors begin their relationship with the brand. And there's also the Centigraphe. And so when you look at the chronograph, again, this is accurate to 1/100th of a second, and it's displayed by a seconds hand that completes one revolution every 6 seconds. Most chronographs they measure kind of 1/10th of a second. Journe's does 1/100th of a second. Without a split seconds mechanism, they do it through a pure gear train architecture. And again, these folks won the GPHG Chronograph Prize in 2009. And now we're going to get into one that I think is unique as well. They have the Sonnerie Souverain. And this is Journe's grand complication, a striking watch that chimes the hours, quarters, and minutes when you want it to, on demand. They're produced in very tiny quantities. The prices are on request, which is, painful. And it's one of the most complex sonnerie mechanisms in modern watchmaking. And they also have this thing called the Line Sport. It's the sportier titanium case version of the collection. Same mechanical philosophy, more approachable aesthetics, still with rose gold movements inside. Every piece in the collection is made in like 38, 40, or 42 millimeters, platinum or 18 karat gold cases, leather straps or metal bracelets, boutique retail typically only. Annual production is around 900 watches per year, and that's across the entire range. So, for context, Rolex makes roughly in the first 20 minutes of a Monday morning. That's what FP Journe's gonna make in the entire year, right? So Journe has no interest in making more than that. They have been explicit about this as well. And so I think it's for me, for context, I think it's fascinating. They don't want to make more watches. They're explicit about this. The workshop is sized in a way that it is produced and it's designed in a way that is doing exactly what they want it to be able to do. Okay, so now let's get into the next section. Section 5, segment 5 is Journe on Journe, and I'm going to call this the philosophy section. So the man's own words and his way of thinking about watchmaking, I think, what makes him distinctive beyond just like the technical component. So I'm going to do my best to tell you what makes François-Paul Journe distinctive in a way that goes beyond his movements. Because, there are other great watchmakers out there. There are other people producing technically extraordinary watches. What makes Journe who he is in this hobby goes, I think, well beyond that. And the most almost constitutionally opposed to pretension. And I think this is interesting as well. In an industry that's built on the careful management of mystique, Journe tends to say what he actually thinks. He's funny in the way that people who are supremely confident in their work can be funny, with this kind of dryness that lands because he's earned the right to be dry. And again, when we talk about, when he was asked about Rexhep Rexhepi, again, who we discussed in episode 13, trained under a Journe, right, himself before he founded Acribia. He said that Rexhep was his favorite young watchmaker, and then again he added, now that especially that he stopped copying me. And again, that line, that's the whole man in just a handful of words. He loves the young watchmaker. He trained enough to call him his favorite. He's self-possessed enough to frame it as a compliment to himself, right? And I think he's talked about what drove him to make watches in terms that sound like more of a novelist than an engineer. He wanted to own a tourbillon. He couldn't afford one. So he decided to take the path that he was going to make one for himself. That's not the language of a technician optimizing production process. That's the language of someone who's genuinely haunted by an object that he couldn't possess, and so he wanted to own one, and whose path to possession was to make something from nothing. That's kind of the orientation toward the object, towards something itself, rather than toward the market or positioning or brand strategy. And this is what I think the invenit et fecit or fecit actually means in practice. He invented it because he wanted to know if something was possible. He makes this stuff because it's the only way he knows how to properly understand what he's inventing. He has to do it from scratch. He doesn't want to purchase it from Atelier or someone else making them and then put them into his movements. He wants to make them. And there's a line from FP Journe's own website that has kind of stayed with me. And if we talk about things haunting me, this is kind of one that haunts me. He talks about his time in his uncle's restoration workshop handling, great historical pieces. And he says that this period allowed him to, quote, meet many important collectors, but also to understand, quote, origins of watchmaking. No, not the history of watchmaking, the origins, the thing the craft was reaching for before commerce and scale and branding arrived. Journe spent 50 years trying to get back to those origins by making watches that are fully thought out, that are fully thought through. And this is the part that gets me, is that they are fully made by the same person who invented them and who imagined them. That's what that means. And that is, I think, in the end, why we've spent, building up to 19 episodes to get to this point, because I didn't feel like I was worthy to even discuss this material. I felt like I wasn't going to be able to provide ample respect for what this person has done. And I'm hoping, again, I think maybe after 19 or, the end of the first season as it comes to a close, I'm hoping that somehow my voice is going to come through in a respect for what this person is doing. Now, segment 7, why Journe matters. You're also going to know that I left out a section about Journe in regard to the quartz section. We can get into the quartz watches as well and how magnificent those watches are, but I'm going to stick to the ones that I know the most about. So again, the show's argument. I'm going to explain this to. So I'm going to pull some threads together, hopefully, and I'm going to connect Journe back to what this show is really about. So let me kind of make the full argument now. So in episode 10, we talked about hedonia and eudaimonia, the watches that make you happy and the watches that make you you. We said that a healthy collection has both, but that the most meaningful watches are the ones whose value lives entirely inside of you, in what you understand them to be. In episode 11, we talked about Rolex, the brand whose value lives in kind of a significant part in the recognition and what the watch says about the world around you. In episode 12 and 13, we trace bloodlines to Renault and Papy through Grubel Forzi and the Gronefelds and Pequenet, and then to snuck in Rexhep Rexhepi, and the watchmaker whose pieces are really invisible to anyone outside of this hobby who's really in deep, and whose entire value lives in what you know, what the wearer knows. And now, as you know, we've come kind of full circle to episode 19 and we get to FP Journe. FP Journe, to me, is the connective tissue of the independent watchmaking world. The Gronefelds came from Renault and Papy. Rexhep came from Journe's own workshop. Philippe Dufour, whom the Crador Micro Artist Studio folks had traveled to Switzerland to learn from, is Journe's peer and contemporary. And the network of the finest watchmakers in the world runs through a handful of people. And it does seem to me, as I look and I step back and I do more homework, that Journe seems to be this central node. He's the answer to the question of this show that we've been circling since the very first episode. What does a watch actually mean? A Journe watch means that one person with a formal education that was interrupted by expulsion, I'm sorry, Francois, for bringing that up, with a family connection who gave him a second chance, with 8 years spent handling the greatest watches of of 3 centuries in Paris in a restoration workshop, and then decided at age 20 that he wanted to build a tourbillon, and then spent 7 years building it, and then 15 more years building everything else that followed. That is what a watch can mean. Not a logo, not a wait list, not a secondary market multiple, just one person's obsession, made physical, handed to another person, who wears it on their wrist for decades. Invenit et fecit. Invented and made. That's the argument. That is what this show has been building toward. All right. I hope that landed okay. Segment 7, we're going to get into what's next, and also known as the season 1 finale. This is a teaser for episode 20, and again, I hope that this comes across as warm, but also anticipatory of just one, my appreciation, and then also excitement to bring season 1 to a close. I'm honored to be able to do this. So next week is the season finale of What's on Your Riste. Season 1 so far has had 19 episodes. We've been to Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, France, America, Japan, Britain, and we have this growing arsenal of followers now across the globe, which is just, it's nuts. And we've talked about philosophy and security and vintage watches. We've talked about the psychology of buying a Rolex and the mechanics of spring drive, and the story of a refugee from Kosovo who grew up to make the most quietly extraordinary watches on earth, and a French watchmaker who trained him. And so next week, before we close this season out, I want to hear from you. And so the second half of episode 20 is going to be something that I shuddered to do and not do, but I'm going to do something that I know some podcasters just hate and other ones just build their livelihood on. So I'm going to sneak it just as a half of an episode, okay? It's going to be my listener mail section. These are the letters or messages that I've gotten that have come in. Things about like hedonia and eudaimonia, stories from like episode 10, the Rolex friend confession from episode 11, the I once saw a Shep in person and this is what it was like. I actually got one of those stories, which is pretty cool. Episode 13, the British watchmakers, and then episode 18, and everything else that has just been generous from people to send me. So I'm really excited. So I'm going to read some of them on air. I'm going to respond to some of them, and I'll let you as the community kind of speak as well. Now, this show has always been about conversation, not just the brands and the movements and stuff, but really not going beyond just the history. But I really like to talk about the people who love this hobby so much that they made watches that mean something to them, and then they share them with us. So the first half of the finale is going to be this reflection on the season. It will be what the show has been and what we've learned, and then where I think season 2 is going to go. And there are some places that we haven't been yet, some makers that we obviously haven't covered, some conversations that we haven't even started yet. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of map out what that looks like. But the second half of the episode is going to really belong to you. It's going to be this moment where if you have a letter, a story, a memory, a question, a collection update, a watch you've been wearing since episode 3, this is the moment where you'll send it to me, okay? And we're going to use the contact information, Riste, Riste, podcast@gmail.com to send me information. And again, I'll read some of those ones on air. Now, one season, again, 20 episodes. Hopefully I'll do my best to close it out the right way. Okay, so that has been episode 19 of What's on Your Riste. In this episode, if you gave you something, if you one can afford an FP Journe, or if you've ever seen one in person, or if you simply look up the resonance and you get to sit with it for a second online, that's the right response. To François-Paul Journe, for the 7 years in that Parisian workshop outside of business hours, for the tourbillon you built at 20 because you couldn't afford to buy one, for the rose gold movements when everyone else said brass is fine, for the resonance, which took 15 years to work, for training Rexhep, for the quote about Rexhep, for all of it. This hobby is unimaginably richer because you never stopped. I'm Wachowski. Take care of yourselves and wear something good. And if that's an FP Journe, goodness gracious, you are you're too fancy for this podcast. Have a great day.
In the old brass glow, you bend the morning thin. Little rooms of steel where the minutes sleep within. Tiny moonlit screws and a patient hand. You turn a silent world till it learns to stand.